Creativity is killing your creativity. Yep, that's the premise of this video. In this video, I want to explain why a lot of artists struggle with being productive. And when I say a productive artist, usually I'm referring to aspiring professionals, people that want to be a professional, usually more designers than artists, but this is going to be very beneficial for artists as well. To give you a bit of context, my name is Antonio, and I've been a concept artist in the game and film industry for over 8 years. I've ran my own studio, so I know what it's like to be productive. To be able to be productive, to must be productive. And there's nothing wrong with actually having a system of being productive. And that's what I'm going to talk about a bit, about systems and processes. And for artists, that sounds incredibly boring and incredibly rigid, but actually it's liberating. And I'm going to tell you why. Now, to do that, I'm going to need to give you an analogy. Now, before I continue, we actually know that almost 70% of you guys watching are not subscribed. That's outrageous. All right? So show us some love and hit the subscribe button. Thank you. And I'm going to have to talk about business because actually this comes from the business world. And what they essentially state in business is that anyone that wants to grow a business needs to have a way of doing things. And so the problem often, and this is for you as artists, but also beginning business owners, so anyone watching that is also a beginner business owner, is you start with building a business, and in the beginning it's just you. Right? And you offer a service or you're building a product, whether that's baking pies or whatever it is, and you're offering that to people, right? So you're solely responsible for making them. And then you hire someone because business is booming and they're doing something, they're alleviating a task from you. And then Sam joins the team and Mohammed joins the team and Kelly joins the team. And suddenly there's a lot of people in the team and they all have their own responsibility. Now, the catch here is that often these businesses are still worth nothing. The reason for that is what they call key man risk, or a lot of the tasks and responsibilities of the business are solely reliable on one person. And this is very dangerous because there's no way that you can sell the business. And when people say sell the business, they only think about money. But actually what selling a business is actually transferring the business to another entity that can repeat whatever you were doing and scale its operations so that it becomes naturally more profitable. Businessy talk. Not for you, I know, but it's leading me to a point. The reason this fails is because there's no way of doing things. And this is where it gets interesting for us as artists as well. Because what dictates a successful business is that there are systems in place that are repeatable and predictable. Predictable to the extent that they are able to be predictable. But at least that there's documentation in order, written documentation of a way of doing things in the business. And this is beneficial because when Kelly leaves the team, she can be replaced by someone else and the business just can run as it were before. And that's very important for a business because otherwise you don't really have a business. You have a collection of people doing a job and only they know how to do the job. So systems are in place in order to ensure that the business can keep going. Very easy to grasp, very hard to implement. That's the businessy stuff of doing things. Now, actually, when it comes to artists, I always draw artists with a French beret, I don't know why. When it comes to artists, the same problem occurs, but not on the same level. And so what it means is that you as an artist, you have your way of designing something. But in the beginning, what you actually end up doing is you see someone doing something and you copy that. And then you see someone else doing something and then you copy that. And you're in a bad mood and then you do something else. And you're not feeling it today and so you do something else. And suddenly you're very creative and you're very optimistic and you're like, I'm gonna change it up today. And so what happens is that there's all these different versions of the same you doing different types of processes to get to the same result, right? To get to some type of a design, right? To get to some type of artwork, cool thing. Wow, amazing. Okay, so that's what happens. So the problem here is that you really don't have any way of doing things. You don't have a fixed set of rules that you apply for yourself, or at least guidelines that you apply for yourself in order to get to an outcome. Now, in the beginning, when you're starting out, ignore this, right? You need to experiment. You need to do your thing. You need to get out and actually find out what process you like. But I've seen this with experienced artists, or even, let's say, not that high level of artists, but that they've been doing it for a very long time. They don't really have a way of doing things. And what ends up happening because of that is that you always are confused, and you always are a little bit more demotivated on how to start your artwork because you don't have a blueprint. It's like, I don't feel well today, or like things didn't go well at work today, and I'm gonna draw because I want to draw, but I'm not really feeling it, so I'm just gonna do something random. And then another day, when you see a tutorial from an artist you really like, you're like, oh, I'm gonna copy exactly that, and so you change your entire process again. And this is dangerous because you'll never settle into a way of doing things, right? And this is where I want to get to. The way of doing things is very important to your creativity. That's the premise of this video. A lot of people think that creativity is you pull it out of thin air like that. That's not what creativity is. Again, like I mentioned and repeat many, many times, creativity comes from limitation. And that limitation also exists in your process. So if we go to visually represent what a process is, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4 step, right? It's like starting at step 1, going to step 2, going to step 3, going to step 4, going to ultimately the cool artwork, right? So that's your way of doing things. And all of the artists that I know, that I look up to, have a way of doing things, whether it's in the medium they use, the process they do, the way they go about collecting reference, the way they go about designing or ideating. They always have a certain way of doing things. And this is actually very desirable because, you see, once we have a way of doing things, once we understand a step that we go through in order to get to our result, now we can build on top of this. We can enrich this. We can make this better. And this is super important because you want to be able to experiment within your way of doing things so that you can optimize your way of doing things. But if you don't have a way of doing things, and there's like a million different other ways that you do things here and here and here, you end up so lost, you almost start over every time you need to make a design. Now, again, for those of you that are just hobbyists and sometimes you just want to draw a flower or want to draw your dog, I'm not saying you need a way of doing things. I'm talking to people that want to be productive, either from a hobby point of view, want to make their own comics, or from a professional point of view, they want to get into concept art, they want to get into comics, they want to get into illustration. You need a way of doing things because you want to enrich that process. That's very important. And I think sometimes because we're in the creative industry, we are cheated into thinking that we don't need a process because creativity, right? Creativity is not a reason. Creativity exists in limitation. So if we limit our process, we can be more creative in our process. Now, what can that process be? Well, for me, for instance, a lot of artists will start by collecting reference. I never do that, right? I have like maybe a pre-process over here where I do a lot of studies of things. And when I have my studies, I start designing. So my first process is actually just scribbling, like literally, like just going wild, being messy. When I find something, because of my visual library that I like, from that scribble, I will start refining that into process number 2. And when I hit a limitation, then I will collect reference. And so from there, I can start refining that using the reference. And then from there, I can take what I've refined and ultimately polish it until I have what I want. And usually this is my process. I start scribbling, then I start designing based on what I have in my visual library. Then I will collect reference to just have better design details. And then I will go into refinement. Usually this is how I build my characters, build my scenes. And so I have a way of doing things. And this is important for me because each of these steps I can now optimize. how do I scribble or go about ideating? What shapes do I tend to use? What works for me really well? Even to like what brush or program works really well for me to scribble and ideate in. And then in step number 2, what shapes do I need? What understanding, what fundamentals do I need to refine those scribbles? And once I understand what I need there, then when I go into collecting references, like where do I prefer to collect my references? What references do I like to pull from? What references don't I like? What do I avoid? What subject matters do I like? So all of these steps I can now optimize and refine so that when I need to draw or design something, when I'm not feeling it, I still have a process. And as a professional, guys, I can not stress enough how important that is. When I look at some of my favorite artists, like for instance, Jesper Esching, Magic the Gathering artist, I know he produced a lot of illustrations. I'm 100% sure that there were days that he hated painting, or he just wasn't feeling it, or he had, a fight at home, or whatever it was, right? And he still had to produce a painting. And when you don't have a way of doing things, it becomes increasingly more difficult to produce that painting. It was the exact same thing for me when I ran my studio and we had to do character designs. There were days that I wasn't feeling it, but because we have a way of doing things, and then especially as a team, we had a way of doing things where someone was responsible for the thumbnail ideation phase, someone was responsible for design, someone was responsible for refinement. When you can rely on that process, it's much easier to still be productive. And I think that's very important if you want to be somewhat successful in what you do. Because in contrast to selling your business from, your team to another team, what you're actually doing is you're transferring your process from happy Antonio to sad Antonio to annoyed Antonio to busy Antonio. And so you're transferring your way of doing things so that at least the outcome is still productive. And that is very important when you want to have some productivity in your artistic journey. So early on, as a beginner, you don't have a process. You don't know what that looks like, right? You don't know where to start. First and foremost, you just need to understand the fundamentals on how you're going to do things. But trust me, at some point when you have subject matters that you like, when you have a medium that you really like, you'll start to pick up on things you start repeating. And I think it's very important that you document this and understand that you really enjoy this way of doing things. You really thoroughly enjoy maybe, first looking at reference, trying to study a pose, and then from that pose, take it into something of your own. I've seen this with other artists that just like to copy a reference photo painterly, like plein air style, and then start building their own thing out of it. That's their process. They look at reference and they use that reference very creatively. So that's their defined process. Other people like me, I just like to start scribbling, trying to find things in my mind's eye and then go from there. And then I have a very sort of rigid process on how I go through that. And I think that you need to find that for yourself so that you can become more creative with the outcome instead of the process itself. Because being creative in the process is not a flex. It's like, oh, this day I'm going to do that and that day I'm going to do something else. Sometimes you can experiment just to sort of test yourself and see if you can surprise yourself. But if you want to be productive, having a good system is very important. All right. So that's all I wanted to say. Like, creativity is not in the process, it's in the outcome, what the result is and how you work with limitations in order to make something creative. But having a system, a way of doing things is something you should be actively thinking about. And the best way to do that is to just find things you enjoy, because ultimately you want to enjoy your process when you're making art, when you're doing business as well, when you're going to the gym, when you're doing any type of sports, when you're doing any type of hobby, you want to enjoy the process of what you're doing. And if you can document that, or if you can remember that for yourself, that there's certain things that you like to do, certain way of doing things, certain sequences that you prefer, and you don't have to look at other people for that. If you like it, then you should do it that way. All right? With that said, as always, happy creating and happy drawing. See you later.